Hi, everybody. Let's continue on our journey through the book of Philemon here. We left off last time at verse 12. Let me get here 1 second and let's go ahead and let's read what Paul's going to say to Philemon next. I'm going to start reading in verse 12. Let's start at verse 12. I am sending him back to you, sending my very heart. Verse 13 says, I would have been glad to keep him with me in order that he might serve me on your behalf during my imprisonment for the gospel. But I preferred to do nothing without your consent, in order that your goodness might not be by compulsion, but of your own accord. For this purpose is why he was parted from you for a while, that you might have him back forever, no longer as a bondservant, but more than a bondservant, as a beloved brother, especially to me, but how much more to you, both in the flesh and in the Lord. See, this portion of the text of Philemon is all about this idea of relationships. And we see three key relationships here to this book, to this portion of the book of Philemon. So the first one here I want us to point out is that of Paul and Onesimus. Paul and Onesimus. Look at this in verse 13. I would have been glad to keep him with me. Paul was saying, Philemon, I wish I could have kept him, but I know that the right thing to do was to send him back to you. He would be of great usefulness to me, and he would serve me on your behalf, Philemon. But, Paul knew that that wasn't the right thing to do. See, I said last time that Onesimus means useful. Onesimus was useful to Paul. He was useful in his ministry, useful in Paul's refreshing. He was useful. The second relationship here we see in verse 14. Verse 14 says this, but I preferred to do nothing without your consent, in order that your goodness might not be by compulsion, but by your own accord. So the second relationship we see here is Paul and Philemon. Paul and Philemon. We see that they have a good relationship all the way through so far. Paul has talked about how great Philemon has been a refresher to him. How Paul has said that Philemon is a co-laborer, if you read down to verse 17. So if you consider me your partner, it says in verse 17. Paul's saying, Philemon, I'm sending Onesimus back to you, and I want you to forgive him. I want you to forgive him. But I want you to do so not because you have to, but because you want to. See, here we see willingness. There's a willingness between Paul and Philemon, that Philemon would be willing. Look at what he says here. But I prefer to do nothing without your consent, in order that your goodness, so that his good deed, forgiving Onesimus, receiving Onesimus, might not be by compulsion, not because you have to, but of your own accord, but willingly. Third relationship we see here is that of between Philemon and Onesimus. Philemon and Onesimus. Verse 15 and 16 read, for this is perhaps why he was parted from you for a while, that you might have him back forever. Paul's putting forth a hypothetical situation here, realistically. Paul's saying, Philemon, could it be that God, in his sovereignty, had Onesimus run away from you so that you might have him back forever in eternity? Because he goes on to say, no longer as a bondservant, no longer as a slave, but more than a slave, as a beloved brother, especially to me. Paul's saying, especially how much of a beloved brother Onesimus is to me, but more so to you. But more so to you. Both in flesh and in the Lord. How much more is Philemon useful to you? Philemon, the name Philemon means affectionate or kind. See, Paul here is reminding Philemon that he needs to be that of forgiving. He needs to be kind and show kindness to Onesimus in forgiving him. Well, what does that say about us and the relationships that we have? What can we learn about how to do interpersonal relationships, even in this COVID-19 where we're having to do everything virtually. What does this mean about us? What can we learn from this? Well, the first thing here that we can learn is from Paul and Onesimus' relationship. And that's simply to be useful. I heard it once said that a man, as he journeyed through the States, back when cars were just starting to get on the scene, I heard the story of a man who would walk from town to town to town, all the way across the country. And as he went, he said, I only have one goal in mind, and that's to be useful. Useful. How are you being useful during COVID-19? How are you being useful in this pandemic? How are you going to be useful when this is over? Are you useful to those that are around you? Are you willing to let yourself be a servant to others? Are you going to be useful? Number 3, we learn from Paul and Philemon's relationship. We learn that of willingness. Paul asked Philemon to willingly forgive Onesimus. Are you actually willing to serve? Not because pastor told you, not because it's the right thing to do, but because you want to serve one another. Romans talks about how we should try to be outdoing one another in brotherly love. Are you able to? Do you want to serve? Are you willingly giving up of yourself for the sake of others? See, even in this COVID-19, God still wants to use willing people for his service, for his glory. And the last thing we find here is that if we're in any type of relationship, no matter if it's virtual like we are having to do now or whether it's beyond, we're going to have to be that of forgiving. And we have to have a relationship of forgiveness. Paul was asking him to say, hey, I want you to forgive me. He is a beloved brother to you now. Paul literally was taking the playing field, and in Roman culture of that time, Philemon was here and Onesimus was down here. But Paul was saying, hey, he's a beloved brother. I want you guys are now on equal playing fields. You're brothers in Jesus. Forgive him, Philemon. Be kind to him. Paul was giving him an opportunity to act his name. Friends, I want you to know something as well. As Christians, we are called to forgive one another. In the Lord's Prayer, it says this. It says, and forgive us our debts as we also forgive our debtors. God expects us to be forgiving those who are around us. So what do you need to do today? Maybe you need to be doing all 3 of these things. Maybe you need to be useful. Maybe you're on the edge and you're like, I'm just going to take this COVID-19 thing. Sit back, relax, drink some iced tea and call it good. You're not being useful. Are you willing to go and serve? Not because you have to, not because I tell you to, not because of any other reason, but just because you are willing to serve Jesus. Lastly, are you forgiving people today? My guess is you have to forgive somebody every single day. Are you doing that? Are you showing the forgiveness that Christ has forgiven you? Because Christ died on the cross to take the punishment for your sin away. I think you can forgive the people that you come into contact with. Just a few thoughts from the book of Philemon. There's so much in this little book. We're going to continue our journey as we go along. But I hope that you are useful, willing, and forgiving in your relationships this week. I'll see you in another video real soon.